All right, fingers crossed that that's better this time. I can't tell in my headset, which is the odd part, but it is what it is. Neal McCready, joined by Ole Miss Chair of Economics Josh Hendrickson, here for episode 36 of the Josh Hendrickson Show. Josh, how are you?
Doing well.
All right, we started this last time, so we'll try again. We'll just try again. It says it's better. Yeah, okay. We're getting rave reviews. Rave reviews. I would say that I'm a technological genius, but what I did was turned everything off and back on and unplugged and things of that nature. So good for me. And my voice, I do sound different. My voice is gone. I was at a soccer game last night and I screamed a lot. And then, if I'm being completely honest, I wrote a lot today about it, and I got really emotional at times. And so I've been a mess. And I did 2 shows already today, so I'm just kind of, voice is gone, but I'm good. I'm fine. All right, Cubs. You're a Cubs fan. I'm a Cubs fan. We're gonna get the tariffs, USAID. We're gonna get to all that stuff. This is far more important. Spring training starts in a week. I paid no attention to Alex Bregman stuff when this started a few weeks ago. Full disclosure, I have a love-hate for the Astros. I hate them, but I acknowledge how good they are. I was really excited about Kyle Tucker, kind of excited about Ryan Presley. And now it sounds like we're trying to go for the whole damn roster. And the whole Alex Bregman thing, I paid no attention to it. I just assumed he'd stay in Houston. Then there was talk about Detroit. There's talk about Toronto. And there was like this thing about, and the Cubs are involved. And I was like, that's his agent. And now there's like, the Cubs have this creative $100 million offer on the table. And I'm like, the Cubs are creative? Like, what? So, Alex Bregman, are you allowing yourself to get excited about a potential 4-WAR player who would push the Cubs into favorite status in the NL Central?
When I think about this rationally, it looks like this might actually happen. It seems like it's moving in that direction. If I think about this as a fan, I just assume that like there's no way this is actually going to happen. I just prepare for disappointment.
Yeah, I always make fun of not make fun. I pick on fans that are like doing the whole, with Ole Miss especially. It's the "We Are Ole Miss" thing, the WAOM. Like we just expect horrible things to happen. I'm like, you're generally doing well, And then the Cubs thing comes around. I'm like, oh yeah, the sky's gonna fall. The wind's going to blow. Bartman's going to get reincarnated. Greg Maddux is going to come back in his prime as a Brave. I mean, just all these things are going to happen. It's going to be, what do they call it? A Cubby occurrence is what Harry Carey used to call it. So, yeah, yesterday was the first day that I even allowed myself to remotely think that this thing was possible. And then today, literally, it was so funny. I was laughing at myself. I was like looking for things to get my mind off of what I was trying to do and write and stuff. And somebody had done an analysis of, well, if you put Bregman in Wrigley Field, here's what happens. And at that point, I immediately talked myself into, he sucks. We don't need that.
No, it's I don't know. I guess over the years, when I was younger, I would say I was a big baseball fan. Like I would watch any baseball game that was on. But as time goes by, I realize like I'm actually just like more of a Cubs fan. Like, I mean, I'll occasionally watch another team if there's like a really good story, but I find myself like only watching the Cubs. And the problem is like to some extent that's ruining my fandom because they're just so boring the last few years.
Yes.
That it's just like, I just, I don't know. I'm not as invested, but then I also can't get into like the other stuff because I kind of feel like their boredom is like the level of boredom that that they've been imposing on me just makes me not want to watch other baseball games. And then, I don't know. I think that I'm just sort of gravitating more over time towards fandom of the team rather than the game overall. Whereas I used to just be like a big baseball fan, but the Cubs were my team. And now I'm just kind of like, I'm a Cubs fan and like occasionally watch other baseball games.
So I promise we're getting other things, but I think that is becoming prevalent in sports. I think it's one of the reasons that actually people don't know as much. I'm talking about myself too. We don't really know as much about sports as we used to because now we can watch our teams and exclusively our teams. And you don't watch anything but your teams
Mhm.
unless you sort of like make yourself go, no, I'm going to watch. I'm going to get an NFL Sunday ticket, and I'm going to watch Red Zone, and I'm going to watch different things, and I'm going to watch. Like, it's been funny for me, and Chase will admit this to you. Chase Parham, he's a big college baseball guy, and he covers Ole Miss and does a great job covering Ole Miss. But obviously, he spends his weekends covering Ole Miss. And over the years, I was like, I need to do a better job of keeping up with this, because we do a podcast every day, and he'll come in and he's like, LSU and Alabama. And I'm like, I have no idea. And so I started watching. And over the last few years, me trying to do homework, I've probably watched more college baseball than he watches. And so when we do the show, he's obviously more proficient on the Ole Miss stuff because that's his beat. I mean, I would hope. But I'm probably more or equally knowledgeable on like the top 8, 9 teams in the SEC. And sometimes I think it kind of bothers him. Like, I've impeded on his territory a little bit. Like, Tennessee's really good. I can sort of tell you about, well, here's what they're doing. Here's kind of how they play. Here's what LSU's doing. Here's kind of what they do. And that's, but I had to make a conscious effort to do it. Like, okay, I'm going to turn on, the LSU Vanderbilt series here. And even though I might be watching an NBA game, while I'm sitting in here working, I'll put the, Arkansas, Florida series on here and flip around. And I'll see, 2, 3 innings of kind of every team over the weekend and sort of get a feel for teams. But that's the point. You have to make a conscious effort to do it. And I'm the same way with you with the Cubs. The last 2 or 3 years, the Cubs have been so painfully average, not horrible. Because sometimes you can kind of enjoy a horrible team.
Yeah, because there's like a glimmer of hope on the horrible team. Like, you're like, well, we got a couple guys.
Yeah, we're
right?
playing the kids.
Yeah,
we're playing the kids. Yeah, I mean, look, hey, we're going to get the 5th pick in the draft. And when you're just milquetoast average, and the Cubs have been 83 and 79 the last 2 years, you're just average. And you're boring. And they have this collection of, like, nice guys. Like, you look at Ian Happ, and you're like, perfectly nice guy, kind of boring. Dansby Swanson, nice dude, boring. And so it just, that's been my observation as well. All right, we'll stop with that before people get furious. All right, there's a lot to this. Where do you want to start? You want to start with tariffs?
We can start wherever you want.
All right, let's start with tariffs. First, whenever I hear the word tariff, I just think tax.
Yep.
Explain the whole tariff thing to me like I'm 6, and why all these countries under the threat of tariff have basically gone, all right, cool, we'll do whatever you want.
So a tariff is basically just a tax on, a good that's coming in from another country, right? So you have these import tariffs, anything that's getting imported into the United States. Well, I mean, sometimes they might be broad-based, so it might be like a particular good. Sometimes it might be aimed at a particular country. So Trump's tariffs have been aimed at particular countries. So if you say, okay, we're going to impose tariffs on China, then what that means is that any goods that are being imported from China, there's going to be a tax on that. Now, the issue here is that whenever there's a tax that gets levied, it's a question of like, well, who's going to pay the tax, right? So if you're importing some good and, it normally costs, $10, and they put a tax of $2 on it, then the question is like, well, what happens to the price that like I pay as a consumer versus what happens to what the producer pays? So if the producer can actually just pass all of that cost on to me, then I'm going to pay the $10 plus I'm going to pay the $2 tax, right? So I'm going to end up paying $12. On the other hand, if I'm if like the United States is kind of like the main buyer of that product, then what might actually happen is like the consumers actually still just pay $10, but now the producer is only going to receive $8 because they got to pay the tax. And normally what happens is that you sort of meet in the middle somewhere. So normally what's going to happen is that the consumer is going to pay some of the tax, the producer is going to pay some of the tax. And on tariffs, the thing that makes this difficult is we're talking about like worldwide goods. So a lot of times consumers tend to pay more of the tax than producers. And this is why you hear a lot of criticism of people saying, well, we're the ones who are going to end up paying the tax because like everything that we buy is just going to be more expensive now. And the thing is like that actually applies in a lot of circumstances. But there are unique conditions about the United States that make it such that that's not always the case for us. And one of the reasons it's not always the case for us is the United States is typically like the biggest market that people are exporting their goods to. And so as the biggest market, if we don't want to pay higher prices, where else are they going to go to sell their goods? It's not to say that they don't have alternatives, but they would have to like lose out on this big market. So for the United States consumer doesn't generally end up paying all of the tariff, whereas if you tried to do this and I don't know, you were like Poland or something like that, like your consumers would probably just pay the entire tax. The other issue here that makes the United States unique is that, international trade is essentially conducted in dollars. And so if international trade is conducted in dollars, even if consumers face like higher prices because of the tax, then what will happen as a result of those higher prices is they'll start buying less of that stuff. But as we're buying less and less stuff abroad, that means we're also sending fewer and fewer dollars abroad. But people around the world need dollars, and they can't actually make them. And so what happens is people's demand for dollars increases, right? They need to find a source of dollars. So actually what tends to happen when the United States levies a tariff is that the price in terms of the foreign currency goes up. But then the dollar appreciates at the same time, which means you can buy more of the foreign currency with a dollar than you could before. And those two things counterbalance each other. And because they counterbalance each other, the U.S. consumer doesn't tend to pay a lot of the tax on these tariffs because part of this is just being offset by the fact that like, well, yeah, if you start charging us the higher price, we buy less. And so when we buy less, you have fewer dollars. You guys all need dollars. So everybody's scrambling to get dollars, which makes dollars more valuable. But from our perspective, we're paying for the stuff in dollars. Like we're not paying for it in whatever currency they're using, right? And so and so basically what this means is that, the price sort of goes up in their currency, but then it kind of comes down in our currency. And so they kind of offset one another. And so we don't end up paying much of the tax. Now, why is that important? Well, that's important for a couple of reasons. Number one, there are a lot of people who kind of deny that this is the case. There are a lot of people who assume that like, nope, the United States is just going to pay all of this. And like the U.S. consumer is just going to pay all of it. And so, yeah, we'll generate tax revenue, but we do it at our own expense. And like, sure, we won't buy as much from abroad, but we're the ones paying the tax and we're missing out on, our ability to trade with these people, right? So there's foregone opportunities to trade that just don't happen. The issue is that because the United States has this kind of like unique role, the United States is able, like the U.S. consumer is able to avoid, significant amounts of the cost, which means that the foreign producers are bearing more of the cost. And because the foreign producers are bearing more of the cost, this makes these tariffs really unpopular in those other countries, which is why they come to the table and say, okay, what do you want? Right.
So there's some people that are trying to and maybe they're right. I don't know. They're trying to almost minimize the success of the threats, right? If you don't do what we're telling you to do, we're going to impose these tariffs. The countries go, okay, let's at least hit the pause on this. Let's pause the tariffs. Let us start doing some of the things you're talking about doing. And some of the people, like critics of Trump, critics of this administration, for the record, I think critics are good. We should have checks and balances. But they're saying, the stuff that he's asking for is really minimal. It's not, these aren't real wins. We're just hitting the pause button. So from your knowledge, is the stuff that the Trump administration is getting or appears that they're going to get, are these significant policy wins?
Well, it sort of depends on who we're talking about, right? So when we're talking about Canada and Mexico, for example, I think really like the purpose of these tariffs is sort of multifaceted, right? So first and foremost, like some of the commentary that people made was, well, Mexico already said they were going to do that, before the tariffs, and now they said that, and so now they're just committing to do it now, and like Canada said they were going to do that before the tariffs, and now they're just committing to do it now, and so like the tariffs didn't accomplish anything. And so I sort of disagree with this for a couple of reasons. Number one, they didn't agree to do this a long time ago. They agreed to do this in like December of 2024. Like they agreed to do this in like early January of 2024 or 2025, right? So in other words, after Trump got elected, they rationally anticipated that he's going to do these kinds of things.
And very likely the Trump administration sent the message to those countries going, hey, just FYI, when I get inaugurated on the 20th, this is happening.
Yeah. And so the thing is that they were trying to get out ahead of this by announcing these things. The problem is that any country can actually announce whatever they want. Like, I mean, you can come out tomorrow and say, hey, we're going to adopt whatever policy and then never actually do it, right? You can issue a press release. It'll be all over the news. Everybody will talk about it. And then you never actually do it. So part of the issue with the tariffs is like, okay, you made that announcement. And so now you're going to do it because otherwise we're going to impose these tariffs. And so part of the tariffs is actually just getting them to actually implement the things that they claimed that they were going to implement. But the other thing is, it's important to note that the tariffs were not canceled; they were paused. And the reason that they were paused is that so the reason that they were paused is because this allows you to circle back to this later on, and then say, okay, have you actually done what you said that you were going to do? And it gives you the opportunity to say, hey, you know what? That was great, but we have another ask that we want from you. And you can't do that forever, but you can do that again. And if they don't actually fulfill their obligations, then you can impose the tariffs and you can call their bluff and you can go ahead and do it. And so I think that, yeah, I mean, the criticism was, there was this big threat and then, and then they agreed to a pause, but they agreed to a pause just because they had agreed to do things that they had already suggested they were going to do. But they suggested they were going to do them because Trump won the election. And they hadn't actually done them yet. So like an announcement doesn't mean you're actually going to do anything.
So, you know what it tells me, and this is where I think where Trump is different from his predecessors on both sides of the aisle. I mean, this isn't going to be Democrat bashing here because I think you could say this about George W. Bush. I think you could say this about his father. Probably couldn't say it about Reagan as much. I don't know about Ford. Certainly couldn't say it about Nixon. We've had the Nixon discussion. But as a whole, a lot of people get elected. They say, hey, these are things we're going to do. We're going to really roll up our sleeves. And we're going to get to it. And then they kind of half-ass do it, right? To me, the analogy, and it's a bad one, is the guy that goes, I'm about to get in the gym. I'm about to get in the gym, man. I'm about to change this. About to get going, right? And he does. He goes to the gym. And he walks a few minutes on the treadmill, and he plays with some weights. Not really a workout, but just kind of does some stuff. Better than nothing. But we're not going to see real results from this. I mean, this is, and he says, I'm going to go every day. He goes twice a week. Which is better than nothing, but it's not. You're not getting, it's going to take a minute. If that's your path, it's going to take a minute before you see any results at all. I sort of equate that to the way governments run. These people say, hey, we're going to do these things. They get to Washington. Washington's a mess. It's a swamp, for lack of a better word. And everyone's kind of intertwined. And, maybe you do some things where you can tell your most ardent supporters, oh, see, I told you we do this. And we kind of did it. And I think what Trump's done in this mad sprint of a start to his term is he's actually trying to do or doing the things that he said he was going to do. And people are I don't know, maybe having whiplash is the term. I don't know. You're better at this than I am. It just seems people are stunned by it, that he's actually doing the things that he said he was going to do. And in fairness to them, I sort of understand being stunned.
Yeah, I guess I'm of two minds on this. Well, first of all, I mean, there is like the thing that drives me the most crazy about this too is that, especially when it comes to things like the tariffs, is there's this argument that there's no like strategy here, that he just like, he just like does these things or he threatens these things, but there's no real strategy. There's no real thing. And I think that this is the fundamental thing that people don't get. And this gets to your point, is that this administration this time around has a lot of grand strategies. Like all over the place, they have grand strategies. I mean, part of the thing about these tariffs is that, so like, you know, the Canada and Mexico stuff, that was really just kind of about like border issues, fentanyl, like, you know, policing your ports, all these kinds of things like that. That's what that stuff is about. But the tariffs, you know, on China, right? The tariffs that he's threatened on others, like those are not just idle threats. Like those are going to be imposed. And those are not like, you know, like where Mexico and Canada, it was sort of like, hey, if you don't do this, we're going to impose these tariffs. That's the better way to. With China and some of these other countries, it's going to be, no, we're just doing it. Like we're not asking for anything right now. We're just doing it. And part of this is because people have lost sight of, I think like the overwhelming theme and the way to understand the Trump administration is there are a lot of things that are broken. There are a lot of things that are broken. And this administration is a coalition of people who all have like some particular expertise, who know that within their expertise, this is the thing that's broken. And those are the people who are being put in charge. So like on these tariffs, the big thing about the tariffs is that the big thing about the tariffs is we have this system where everything in the world revolves around the dollar. And the issue with everything in the world revolving around the dollar is that the dollar tends to be overvalued. Well, if the dollar is overvalued, that's really, really good for the U.S. consumer because it makes things cheap when we buy them from abroad. The problem with the dollar being like overvalued, the problem is that when the dollar is overvalued, you know what else it makes cheap abroad? It makes labor cheap. It makes other inputs and production cheap. And so what happens is people take their factory and in Ohio and they shut it down and they move it to China or Vietnam or wherever, right? And so the issue is that the Trump administration sees this. They want to maintain that role of the dollar. They want the dollar to continue to be important. They want it to continue to dominate international trade. But what they want is they want to put an end to that offshoring of this manufacturing. They want to bring the manufacturing back. But the only way that you can do that is you have to convince these other countries to kind of revalue their currencies relative to the dollar. And they're not going to do that voluntarily because it's incredibly costly for them to do that. And what they're going to argue is like, well, we don't want to do that because you get all these privileges from the fact that you guys have the world's currency, that you guys get all of these privileges that we don't get. And so why should we have to revalue our currency? Like, that's your problem. You know, you get a lot of benefits, you get a lot of costs, like, you know, deal with it. Whereas the United States says, well, yeah, but like some of the reason that you are able to be prosperous is that like you fall under our broad like defense umbrella, right? If somebody comes and tries to invade your country, like, you know that we're going to come and we're going to help you. And so what you do is you don't spend very much on the military because you know that like the US military is going to back you up. And so their idea is like, well, you should want to revalue this currency because like we're providing you a service. And so, yeah, this is going to cost you something, but like you should bear that cost because we're the ones defending you.
Because you want this service.
Right. And so that's part of it. The other part of it is that, you know, most people don't hold actual dollars. Like if you go to a foreign central bank, they're not just sitting on a bunch of like dollars. What they do is they take their dollars and then they buy US government debt. And the problem is like as the rest of the world grows, this is true of anybody, right? As you have more income, you hold more money, right? And so as the rest of the world's economies grow, they're getting richer, which means they're going to hold more money. As they hold more money, that means that, you know, their central banks are going to be holding more dollars. They're not just going to hold the dollars. They want to earn a rate of return. So they're going to buy US government bonds. And so what happens is that as the rest of the world grows, their demand for US government bonds is growing. Now, what that does is that pushes down our borrowing costs, which is good for us because it means that, you know, we don't have to worry that we're building up too much debt to a point, right? Because what happens is that as borrowing costs fall, because there's all this demand for stuff, what do politicians do? Every pet project should get funded. We're borrowing at 1%. Let's just do it. Like why can't we spend this money? We're borrowing at 1%. You can never borrow at 1%. Like we'll just, you know, we'll build that road to nowhere. We'll build this dream high-speed rail system, right? Like anything that they want to do, it's like, look, we're borrowing at 1%. What could go wrong? Like that's their attitude. And so if you look at the data, what happens is as the rest of the world grows, and has like a greater demand for our bonds, we tend to supply them with those bonds by borrowing more money. And so the thing is that when you do that, what's happening is that if you're growing faster than the rest of the world, that's not really a problem. But the problem is like a lot of these places in the rest of the world, they're very, very poor countries that are starting to get richer, whereas the United States is a very, very mature economy. So those countries are now growing faster than the United States, which means that their demand for our debt is growing faster than our economy is growing. And so if you think about like a debt to GDP ratio, that means the debt is getting bigger faster than the GDP is getting bigger, which means the ratio is getting bigger. And as the ratio gets bigger, it becomes harder and harder to pay off that debt. And
go ahead.
And so the Trump administration is looking at this and going, "No, we can't keep doing this. Like this is not this is not sustainable." And which is another reason that they want to get these people to the table to sort of revalue their currency, because it's sort of like an indirect way of making them take like a little bit of a haircut on some of this debt that they own. But also, I think that if you look at other things that the Trump administration is doing, I think they're very clearly signaling that like what they would like to do is bring deficits down. But by bringing deficits down, what that's going to do is they're not going to be supplying enough bonds to the rest of the world, which is going to lower borrowing costs. But instead of incentivizing politicians to go out and borrow more money to pay for stuff because we're borrowing for free, the Trump administration has said, we're going to start a sovereign wealth fund, which basically means that you would have this fund probably run by the Treasury Department, where they would issue their own bonds, like U.S. government bonds,
okay,
but then they would use them to actually buy assets. So what that would do is, because our borrowing costs are so low, we can buy these assets. The assets will have a higher rate of return than our borrowing rate.
All right, just
and they'll profit.
I'm asking stupid questions.
No. This is a lot of information.
So when you say assets, can you give me an example?
Well, I mean, one thing could be like physical assets, but it also could just be that like they just buy like, an ETF of the stock market or something like that, where they're just like, oh, we're going to borrow this money and then we're just going to, buy this and hold it. And we're going to use the profits to fund Social Security or something like that.
All right. Grind's got a question in the stream. I'm going to ask his question. I want to come back to this. I'm going to kind of ask my question now because I'm afraid I'm going to forget exactly what I'm trying to say. Is this at all interrelated with a lot of the cuts to the bureaucracy right now, where it's like, hey, we're running a budget here? I mean, they use the word budget, even though sometimes it's like, that doesn't look like a budget. I mean, it looks like just a chaos. But they're cutting things because we have this conversation in college athletics a lot now, right? Because everybody's got to come up with $22 million for the lawsuit thing that I try to block from my brain. And so you got to come up with money, and they're trying to do it without going in and going, all right, well, you know what? Let's cut this program, because it's people and it's Title IX and it's stuff. And so they're having to come up with different ways. Like, okay, well, let's raise taxes. Let's monetize the parking lot. Let's all that stuff. So I'm curious on that part. But Grind's question is this. He says, might be a stupid question. The great thing about me hosting the show is that you can't ask a stupider question than I do. I am so good at asking dumb questions that anything you ask is just going to be only moderately stupid compared to my stupidity. He says, should the U.S. not fear the euro taking the spot of the U.S. dollar?
I mean, one of the benefits of that the United States has is that there is really no good alternative here. And I think like the euro at some point might possibly be something that we should be concerned about. But the issue is that the euro like doesn't always have a great track record. Like part of the problem with like the Eurozone in general is that each one of these countries has their own fiscal policy, but then they all share a common currency. And so that's not, whereas in the United States, we have a federal government. So we have a nationwide currency, but we also have the federal government controlling, federal government spending. So so in other words, monetary and fiscal policy can potentially work together or cancel each other out depending on what you need them to be doing at the given time. Whereas in the Eurozone, there's absolutely no way that you can do that because you've got like 20 different fiscal policies and one monetary policy.
Right.
The other thing is that they've screwed up monetary policy a lot. So like they ended up
the Europeans?
they ended up having like a much worse financial crisis than we did, even though the financial crisis like kind of started in the United States. They're back in 2008, they actually ended up like their monetary policy actually made things worse, and they actually ended up going through like an even more severe financial crisis. And so if you are somebody who's looking to diversify away from the dollar, that's going to give you pause, because you're like, well, because if you start adopting that, you're going to inherit any sort of effects, any costs that are created by that system, you're going to inherit them. So should they be concerned about it like long term? I mean, they should be concerned about any viable alternative long term, because if this system is really unsustainable, which I believe that the Trump administration is looking at it and saying, look, unless we change something, it's going to be unsustainable, then we're like, people are going to start to look for alternatives. And so you should be concerned about those all the time. But in the short run, there's not much concern.
All right. My girl, Caroline Levitt, was standing outside of the West Wing the other day. Can I just tell you how much that I have enjoyed watching the backlash with Caroline Levitt? Here is this woman, young woman, 27 years old. This is one of those things you and I talked about privately a minute ago. What I'm about to say is the furthest thing from what people try to accuse you of. This is a young woman, 27 years old. She's a mother. She ran for, for Congress, ran a great campaign. She did not win. She was the one of the spokespeople for the Trump campaign, which won. And he named her his press secretary. And she's quite sharp. And she did her first press briefing with no notes. No notes. Josh, I don't think you could pull that off. And you're like, brilliant. You might could do it. It'd be interesting. But she was totally on top. It was amazing. It was amazing. And the women on The View were like, oh, she's only there because she's a 10, referring to her looks. And I was flabbergasted. I shouldn't be. I was like, wait a minute. You claim to be feminist, which means that you are for women doing well. And here's this young woman, in my opinion, who happens to be attractive, who's on the international stage under some of the brightest lights, performing incredibly well. Comes across as very mature, very knowledgeable, intelligent, obviously. I don't even think, I don't watch her and go, oh yeah, she's kind of hot. No, I just watch her and go, she's sharp, man. I mean, I would hope that's the kind of person that young females, girls would look up to and go, wow, that's, if she can do that at 27, what might I be able to do, right? And yet there's this pushback on her. But anyway, and you can touch on this if you'd like, but she comes out and she says, here's the reason why Elon Musk and others have been taking a look regarding waste and abuse of USAID. And she starts naming specifics. $1.5 million to advance DEI in Serbia's workplaces. I mean, $70,000 is what I loved. I love when she started getting to the smaller ones. Because finish. $70,000 for a production of a DEI musical in Ireland. $47,000 for a transgender opera in Colombia. $32,000 for a transgender comic book in Peru. This isn't even about all the transgender stuff to me. It could have been the most amazing comic book. Why are U.S. tax money that comes out of your bank, out of my bank account, my bank account? I got to write a check here soon. I'm late on it. My wife keeps reminding me, hey, we got to write that last quarterly tax deal, and I just don't want to do it because I hate writing that check, and it puts me in a really shitty mood. I have turned it into like a bargaining deal. I'm like, okay, if I'm going to do that, I got to drink some bourbon first. And she's like, okay, well, all right, that's fair. So anyway, more people should be up in arms about, wait, we're spending our money on what? We need infrastructure in our country, clearly. We need all these things, and we're spending money, U.S. taxpayer dollars, on operas in Colombia and comic books in Peru, and $1.5 million to advance DEI in Serbia's workplaces. And so I see that. She comes out, she says all that, and I go, oh, wow. If they really go in and start chopping, you are going to change the bottom line at some point. Am I crazy?
No, this ties everything all together, and this gets back to your question, which is part of what they're doing with these cuts is because they know that they need to cut spending. But part of it is driven by the fact that, like, regardless of whether we needed to cut spending, this stuff needs to be cut anyway. I mean, if you're familiar with like what the State Department spends money on, if you ever talk to somebody who worked in the State Department, if you ever talk to like a Republican appointee who worked in the State Department, they will tell you the most wild stories about like what the State Department does around the world. The idea behind what the State Department does, what USAID does, all these things, the purpose of this is what they call soft power, right? So we're going to spend money, and it will kind of like influence people in the way that we want them to be influenced, to kind of get what we want without actually having to engage in conflict, right? The problem is like when you read this stuff, it's like, there's no way in the world that this contributes to soft power.
No.
And like the stories that people would tell me, about the State Department, is that like they were running like LGBTQ like events in like Afghanistan. And I'm like, yeah, so this is soft power? Like you're going into a country, okay, that's predominantly Muslim, and you're gonna
nothing like those.
and you're gonna tell them that like they need to have like a pride parade. Like I don't like this is, and this is the thing is like that it's entirely self-defeating. But the point here though is that all of these things, the thing that you have to understand about all of these things is that like you have never, ever, I don't think in your entire life seen a freak out by the Democratic Party as when Donald Trump said, we're shutting down USAID.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
They have lost their minds. And I'm going to explain why.
Okay.
What people don't understand about our government is that we learn, like in elementary school, you learn about like prior generations of politics, right? Like 1800s politics. And the story is always like you had all these city bosses giving jobs to their friends and, you know, doing all this stuff, political patronage, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we help each other. And, I give you stuff out of the government revenue, and you support me and you vote for me and campaign for me and things like that. And what the story that we're told about this era is that this era came to an end. And do you know why it came to an end? Because we passed a law, and so by passing laws, we put an end to like this patronage system. We did not put an end to the patronage system. All we did is we hid it from the general public. Like USAID and all of these organizations, what they do is they funnel money to their friends. That's how this works. Like they just funnel money to their friends. And so what happens is like you work in a Democrat administration, and you're going to leave the administration either because like, you've kind of run your course there, or maybe you lost an election and you're going to leave. And so what do? You leave and you start like an NGO. And you start an NGO, and when you start that NGO, what happens is that the government starts giving your NGO contracts to do these things that they want to do. That's just patronage. You are rewarding a political ally with funding from the government. When you look at USAID, this is what they do. In fact, the biggest scandal that we've probably talked about since we started doing this is all the internet censorship. USAID was funding all of that censorship. What they were doing is they're giving grants to universities, giving grants to people to go out and start disinformation centers, right? And then you get these disinformation centers into these universities, and then everybody wants a piece of it, right? So you get the disinformation center, and then it's like, oh, well, like the computer science people want to use AI to try to identify, misinformation. And then you have the journalism people who want to learn how to identify misinformation. And then you have the sociologists who want to provide the context for disinformation in society, right? And then you've got the political scientists who want to study disinformation because they want to see how it's used in campaigns. And then you've got so what happens is then all of these people start to get dependent on this funding for this thing that's all coming from USAID. And the thing about it is that you're attracting the exact people that you want to give money to. If you are a Democrat, these are all of your friends. These are the people that you want to reward. And so if you look around at this, you've got all of these people working like six-figure jobs at NGOs or six-figure jobs at universities where the money is actually not coming from students. It's not coming from like the state where the university is located. It's coming from the federal government. The federal government is giving them grants to go out and do these things. And USAID went out and they helped facilitate this whole disinformation, this web of disinformation centers all around. And then what they do is that USAID doesn't just do that. They didn't just do this in the United States. They also did it around the world. So they would go to these foreign governments and they would say, well, you got to crack down on disinformation. And then, well, how are we going to do that? Like that, they're like, well, how do we do that? Well, you can hire this NGO and they'll help you identify disinformation. Well, who runs the NGO? Oh, it's their political friends. Oh, how about that? There is a
shocker.
It's just massive corruption all the way down where you just have these people who are being paid high salaries to do stupid jobs that are entirely based on politics and their proximity to where this funding is actually coming from through the federal government. And so the reason that they're freaking out about this more so than anything else, there are things that the Trump administration has done that if Democrats believed their own rhetoric, they would be freaking out about, but they're not freaking out about it. They're freaking out because USAID is being shut down. And then another issue here is like USAID really hasn't been shut down. They've just taken away all of this funding. They've just said, nope, we're not going to do this. We're not going to spend this funding but it still exists. They moved it into the State Department because it already acts as an arm of the State Department anyway. USAID started out as a cutout of the CIA. Like this is not like this, this is not some like this isn't, some do-gooder organization that we set up here, right? So it started out as a cutout of the CIA. It's now basically an arm of the State Department. They use USAID to direct funding to promote the goals of the U.S. State Department. And so what the Trump administration has done is they said, okay, look, you do some good things. Like, for example, like you give like people in other countries like medicine, right? And so we're going to move that into the State Department. And so the State Department will be able to administer those things. But all this other stuff that you do, no, we're not doing that anymore. Like that stuff, that stuff is gone. And
what happens to the Peruvian comics when they take control? I mean, they're going to be pissed.
Well, this is the other thing is that like most of what they're actually spending money on actually seems entirely counterproductive to what the purpose that they claim. Right. Like, so they're like, well, this is important. Like, you've seen all these people stand up and say, well, this is an important like instrument of soft power for the United States around the world. And it's like, no. Like, the things that they're spending money on are not actually like enhancing the United States' power, right? Like they're actually pushing cultural things that piss people off in the local communities and make them anti-United States. So it's not even serving that purpose because it's been completely captured. Because see, this is the problem. They got out and they pushed it too far. They had this massive patronage network. They had this massive patronage network that was supporting all of their friends with federal government money and was allowing them all to make really good money. But they're so committed to this ideology that they had to keep pushing all of this stuff. They had to keep doing it because they had to expand these operations. And when they started getting backlash, people start looking into this and they realize, oh, this is like, look at all these crazy things that they're doing. And when you go through, and this is just USAID. So wait until they start going through the State Department. Wait until they start going through the Justice Department. Wait until they start going through like the Treasury Department. What kind of crap are they spending money on? Because those places all have much bigger budgets than USAID.
USAID gave $8 million. And I think it's more than this because I have a friend in journalism who sent me something a moment ago, and I'm going to open it, but I have so many things open on my screen to talk to you about that I don't want to get lost. Politico can't make their payroll. This is a story that's out today. Politico can't make their payroll because they've been getting $8 million from USAID. Why is the U.S. State Department? I mean, let's follow.
No, I'll
the
tell you how they
lines
do
on
this. No, I'll tell you how they do this. Because now Politico says it's just a technical glitch and it's unrelated to these funding issues. In fairness to Politico, that's what they. That's
you
what
and
they
I,
say.
this appearance of baldness is really just a visual glitch.
Yeah, but here's how they do it, because they don't just give it to Politico. You know what they do? Politico has Politico Pro. Politico Pro costs like $10,000 or something a year for a subscription. Okay, it's like ridiculously expensive. And you know what they do is these government agencies were buying subscriptions for their employees for Politico Pro. So like the FDA had 47 employees who had subscriptions to Politico Pro, and it was costing the FDA $500,000 a year for these subscriptions.
Politico received, this is Liz Wheeler, she tweets, the Politico scandal is worse than you think. It's not $8 million that Politico received from USAID. It's $34.3 million that they received from various swampy federal government agencies.
But you see how this works, right? Because look.
Yeah, I'm listening.
No, you see how this works.
I see the number and I'm like, whoa.
You see how this works, right? Because what's USAID doing? They're setting up all these disinformation centers, okay? Who was leading the charge against disinformation? Politico, right? So you see how this, so they're giving money on all sides. They're giving money to set up the organizations that are studying disinformation. Then they're also giving money through subscription services, through really expensive subscription services, through employees, that is funneling millions and millions of dollars to Politico, who is then, talking nonstop about disinformation and the importance of dealing with disinformation. They also get, they did this, they do the same thing with like New York Times subscriptions. They did this with tons of things.
Yeah, so Politico has all these subscriptions with the Department of Education, Executive Office Building, Food and Drug Administration, Environmental Protection Agency, Centers for Disease Control.
And it's not just subscriptions like $7 a month. They're paying for Politico Pro. They're not paying like what you and I would pay to subscribe to like the New York Times or something. No. Like this is Politico Pro. Like this is like thousands and thousands of dollars a year per subscriber. It's completely insane. And when you think about how all of these things are interwoven.
But Politico is the one. Yeah. I'm sorry. I mean, I'm slow. And when you start putting it together, like I'm going, oh wait, I am following like the lines. You can follow the lines quicker than I do. I have to actually like look at them. This is the same outlet that pushed the Steele dossier, the Russia disinformation, the Biden laptop wasn't real. So now it wasn't just shitty journalism, pardon my language. No. It was criminal. And it was funded by the State Department.
They get all of this money from these.
Am I wrong?
No, like this is the thing, is that you have all of these people getting these ridiculously expensive subscriptions to Politico Pro. So what this suggests to me is like, this is not even somebody who works there like requesting it. This is like the entire office just says, oh, hey, as part of your employment here, we provide you with a subscription to Politico Pro.
But it's totally unnecessary.
No, it is unnecessary, because why would you need that? And like what you are doing is, what you see going on here is you see an enormous corrupt patronage network that is just funneling money to their friends and people who report things the way that they want them reported.
Yeah, I mean, look, Matt says the light bulb finally came on for Neal. Like, guilty as charged, Matt. No question, you're right. I kind of knew these things, but when you see it in black and white.
No, and I mean, this is the thing is
so the CDC thing. This is what interests me about this, right? I've accepted the Hunter Biden laptop thing. I'm telling you, it's the biggest scandal in American political history. It is. The U.S. government.
You know who else USAID gave money to, by the way?
Who?
Burisma.
Wow.
Sorry, I didn't mean to get you off track.
Wow.
Okay.
That makes well, even further solidifies my point.
Yeah.
The U.S. government, the State Department, interfered in an American election. It interfered in an American. So if it will do, what else is it capable of?
Well, I mean, the other thing is like we gotta like just wait until people start digging in and seeing what kind of money was being given to people for COVID.
Well, that's where I was going.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm slow today. I apologize. I've accepted the Biden laptop story. It's fine, and in many ways, I actually kind of think maybe the country's better for it because it got exposed. There's no denying it now. I mean, if you want to bury your head in the sand now, you that's fine. It's cool. But you have to acknowledge, hey, I'm just burying my head in the sand. I'm not going to.
Well, long term, it was really good because all 51 of those people had their security clearances revoked, and now they can't profit from their access to classified information.
Yeah, it's probably a really good thing. In the end, that's a hell of a justification. But sure, I'm talking about me, not you. But now the COVID thing's different because we haven't really fully yet 5 years out acknowledged this. Hayden references a story that I wrote about my son Carson today. Hayden, thank you very much. I'll use him as an example. No one has been held accountable for this yet. Mm-hmm. You have a son my age. And in 2020, my son, your son too, ironically both named Carson, our boys were 13-ish.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I'll just speak about mine for a moment. He was a perfectly healthy, mentally healthy, sharp, happy 13-year-old kid. Good. Life was good. I think the worst thing going on for him was he had the braces, right? Everything else in life was pretty solid. Had a bunch of buddies, was playing sports, was doing great. In school was fun, happy kid. And we did the COVID thing, and we did the lockdown thing, and all of a sudden, and I mean quickly, he's in his room right over there on the PS thing, PS4, I guess is what it was, PS4, so yeah, whatever. And that's how he communicated with his friends. Unlike his sisters, he wasn't old enough to drive yet. He couldn't go find his friends. So yeah, there were a few friends in the neighborhood, but there weren't, he couldn't go see the people that were a part of his social circle. And he couldn't play soccer anymore because his team shut down. Had to. And when the coach tried to practice, some of the crazies were like, well, they're not wearing their masks. No, I'm totally serious.
Yeah, I know.
I'm totally serious. They're not wearing their mask when they take their water breaks. Well, yeah, it's hot, and they're boys, and they're sweaty, and yeah, they're talking to one another because they're excited to see their buddies again. And thank God, I mean, Tim Murphy's a saint for doing it, for getting those boys out there and letting them, and he would put them through the hardcore practice, but he'd give them water breaks because they have to have water.
Yeah.
And in the water breaks, they would do what boys do in water breaks. They talk.
Right.
Oh no! And people out at oh no, they're not wearing their mask. They're not socially distanced. This is terrible. We're all going to die. We've not gotten to the bottom of that, and so what you begin to see, CDC, Politico, all the stuff, is that no, that was a propaganda campaign, organized at very high levels. We haven't gotten into where does the vaccine come into this? A true dissection of what, if any, vaccine-related injuries have occurred. We still haven't done all of that. That needs to be done. And I know we did the mass pardon thing. That shouldn't stop the investigations. In fact, the fact that these people have been pardoned takes away their ability to claim the fifth. They should be put on the stand. We need to get to the bottom of that. That is something that needs to be gotten to the bottom of, in my opinion. You might disagree. Needs to be fully, there needs to be resources dedicated to that, to get to the bottom of that so that can never, ever, ever happen again to our grandchildren, to our great-grandchildren, when you and I are long gone. That can never happen again. And that must be completely exposed so that the history books reflect it properly. I believe this. It is a big thing to me. We messed with young people, and like, my son's fine. He's fine now. And people go, and that's what people will do. That's their push back on you. Well, he's fine. All right. Well, what about the other ones like him who aren't? What about the ones who didn't have the resources he had? What about the ones who didn't have a PS4 to play the little Fortnite game or whatever that they play and talk with each other? What about the ones who didn't have a basketball goal in the driveway? What about the ones who didn't live in a neighborhood where it was safe to go roam and go over to the Pittman's house and go up the street to people's houses? What about that? What about the kids like that? What about the kids like that who completely shut down? We've already seen the results of the test scores.
Mm-hmm.
They're terrible. It's a direct reflection on that. What about that? And so I want this dug into. It's why one of the things I'm all for the Doge Elon thing, not just to save the money and to cut spending and all that stuff. I want it all exposed.
Well, and the other thing too about this is that, I mean, just think about the financial incentives of these companies, right? So Politico was never at risk of going bankrupt because they're bringing in millions and millions of dollars from subscriptions that are being paid for by the federal government.
Yeah.
They don't have to worry about advertisers.
That's money. That's money laundering.
They don't have to worry about subscriptions from rank and file users at that point, right? Like they're bringing in tons and tons of revenue. But you think about competing media. Competing media does have to worry about advertisers. Competing media does have to try to get you to pay for a subscription. And so think about why that's important. Like, oh, we survive entirely on advertising. You survive on grants from the federal government. Well, when these disinformation campaigns come along and they say, you can't talk about that, and they go to your advertisers and say, that person is spreading disinformation, or they go to YouTube and they say, demonetize that advertising. The people who are supported through advertising, they face that feedback mechanism. So those people who are not getting all of this money from the federal government, they got to be really careful about what they say, because if they're demonetized, like, they literally might go out of business. Like, if they lose their advertisers, they might literally go out of business. But if you're just being fed it's millions and millions of dollars of money from the federal government, you don't have to worry about that. And this creates a completely uneven playing field. But that uneven playing field tilts things in the favor of you getting to determine what's misinformation, and you getting to determine, oh, if there's a person who's saying things that I don't like, I can get that person silenced because I can get, I can go to their advertisers and tell them what they're doing. And their advertisers are not going to want to deal with this. And so they're going to drop them. And then that person won't have a voice. But these people we're giving millions and millions of dollars to, they'll be just fine. Even if their readers start to think that, like, they're not being honest with them. So what? They're still bringing in millions of dollars from the federal government in subscriptions.
So they pay their writers a lot of money, and their writers get in line.
Yeah. And then and so you see how this you see how this happens, and it is top to bottom corruption. And they need to dig into this. They need to dig into, they need to get into health and human services. They need to figure out, okay, what are they spending money on? What, who are they influencing? Who are they talking to? All of these kinds of things, because this isn't a USAID problem. This is a federal government problem. And that's part of the issue too, is that the federal government itself had become part of the patronage network, because so many of the people who were working in the federal bureaucracy as career employees were also partisan Democrats. And this isn't conjecture. This isn't like exaggerating. This isn't like a right-wing media talking point. This is, talk to anybody who has worked in these government agencies for a Republican president, and they will tell you what it was like. There's a guy who worked in the Trump administration who wrote a book that probably nobody's ever heard of that's called You Work for Me. And it's a fascinating book because there's a chapter in there where he just has like a bullet-pointed list of, here are all kinds of things that people in the Trump administration instructed their subordinates to do within these government agencies that they refused to do or said wasn't their job, despite the fact that it's literally their job description, or despite the fact that when Biden got elected, they immediately started doing the thing that they had been asked to do prior. Like, there was active, so you have these people who are in these government jobs that are partisan Democrats. They can't be fired. Right. And So they're benefiting from this because they get the cushy government job with the good government benefits. And in fact, we've realized recently that like they only had to come to the office like once or twice a week. And so they get all of this, they get all of this, all of these benefits. Okay. And they can prevent the agenda of a president they don't like from getting implemented, whereas they can enthusiastically implement the agenda of a president that they do like. Like, so it's, it's just layers upon layers of patronage. The bureaucracies themselves are full of your friends who are then, and then you're taking the money that the agency is allocated, and then they're allocating that to other friends who are outside the agency, and this whole thing just continues.
It's fair to call that deep state, isn't it?
That is the deep state. This is what people mean when they say the deep state. Like, that's the thing, is like everybody acts like, oh, the deep state is some kind of like conspiracy theory, or it's some kind of,
well, they make it out like it's it's the evil
dark,
it's
like some shady
in the movie, right?
But it's not. What it is, it's just basic political patronage, where you have all of these people who are all ideologically aligned, who are all financially benefiting from adhering to the ideology, and preventing anybody from changing things relative to the status quo.
Yeah. So, I mean, it makes you wonder, like, how far back this goes. I mean, the whole, I guess since the last time you and I talked, Trump has signed the executive order for the JFK files, the RFK files, the Martin Luther King Jr. files. We don't dig deep enough on the Martin Luther King Jr. thing, by the way. That story, the story of his assassination, his murder,
that doesn't make sense either.
It does not hold up under the slightest bit of scrutiny.
No.
I mean, I can make the Oswald thing. Oswald acted alone. I can at least kind of toy with that and make it go, well, I mean, kind of maybe. The RFK thing, I mean, the autopsy doesn't really hold up with the Sirhan theory. But the Martin Luther King Jr. one, you just can't make that work.
No.
You can't make that make any sense. And it all points back to the same agencies. I mean, they were spying on him. They were accumulating information on things that were allegedly going on in his private life.
And threatening him.
And then ultimately, in my opinion, killing him.
Well, and this is the thing, is that this is what, well, this is the other thing that we have to kind of get to here, is that everything that I've said, thus far is sort of like, well, when Republican administrations come in, they kind of get stonewalled by the existing bureaucracy. But like, doesn't that like pose an interesting question to you also, which is like, why? Why did they put up with it? Like, why didn't they try to do anything about it? Like, why weren't they like, hey, we're not implementing our, they're not implementing our policies like we're asking them to. We need to do something about this. Like, this stonewalling has been going on for a long time, because Republicans, even anti-Trump Republicans, are like, yeah, this has been going on for a long time. But the thing is that nobody even tried to do anything about it. Nobody did anything about it. Nobody made this a big deal. And maybe they just didn't make it a big deal because maybe it's like a political loser. Like when you go to the public and the public wants, more economic growth or something, or like, or lower taxes, and you're like, well, no, actually, we're going to clean up the bureaucracy. I mean, maybe that's as simple as it is maybe it's just not a winning political message until people see things like COVID, until people see things like Russiagate, until people see things like all this disinformation stuff. Maybe that's what it takes for somebody to actually come along and do it. I don't know, but it does beg the question as to why.
That's what I think. I just think people are naturally trusting. That's why scams work.
Mm-hmm.
You'll always hear people go, I can't believe someone fell for that. I'm like, I can. You're a nice person. Sweet lady. Kind. Saw something pop up in her mailbox or on the phone, and she believed it because she's a naturally trusting person. Get it? 100%. Don't judge. Had her bank account wiped out. How'd that happen? Because she's a nice person. Not stupid. Just trusting.
Mm-hmm.
Naive, maybe, but not stupid. Trusting. And I think for the most part, people trusted. Look at the overwhelming majority of people's reaction in March of 2020.
Mm-hmm.
Look at it.
Yeah.
Think about it. It's why, you don't even want to get me going on this again. I'm sorry to everybody. It really bothers me. Like, this one really bothers me at my soul. It really does. I believed them.
Well,
They had the professor in Minnesota come on the shows and stuff and say,
Yep.
it's going to kill 1 out of every 5, 6 people. I'll never forget. I mean, I'm in a dorm. I'm in Reed Hall, University of Arkansas, which, for people who don't know, looks like, if you're an Ole Miss person, it looks like a slightly older version of Stockard and Martin. Okay? Every big campus has those dorms. Those dorms are full of 2 things. Okay? Mold and happiness. I'll never forget it as long as I live. I wish I could find her and make sure she's okay, because it would be a comforting thing. I'm on the elevator. I think Campbell lived on the 5th floor. Yeah, because Caroline lived on the 6th 2 years later. I'm on the 5th floor, and this girl is on the elevator. It's just me and her. And she's clearly been crying. Very average-looking girl. I don't mean that in a mean way, but, just... And she says, I don't understand. And me, being the trusting dumbass, sort of was like, well, it's probably for the best. We can't... can you imagine it spreading through here? And in reality, it'd be the best thing could happen. And I was... And she was like, this is the first place I've ever really had friends. Damn. Think of that sentence, Josh. Think about that sentence, 18, 19-year-old girl. This is the first place I've ever really had friends. I think it reads like 8, 9 stories tall. It's again, Stockard Martin, whatever. And she had friends all on the hall. And in high school, she probably wasn't pretty enough to be one of the cool kids. She wasn't a cheerleader, probably. She didn't dance. She probably wasn't a soccer player. Probably a smart kid, but, awkward. And we took that away. Sent her home. You don't think that's happened all over the country? If it happened at the University of Arkansas, it happened at the University of Iowa, it happened at the University of Kansas, it happened at the University of Mississippi, at Louisiana State, at University of Alabama. Name your school. It happened. Think about that. And no one wants to dig into that and go, this can never happen again?
Well, and that's the thing is, I think the issue is like, we all go about our daily lives and we all have like our job that we do, and we all do our job, and we observe other people that we work with doing their job. We observe our boss doing their job, right? And everything seems to be going fine. So we assume that everybody's doing their job because like there's no problem.
Right.
Right. And I think that's like the metaphor, because I think people just go about their daily lives. Like I never thought about like whether, the person running NIH or the person running the CDC, like had, I never thought about like their level of expertise. I never thought about whether or not they were doing a good job.
George H.W. Bush told people what a hero Anthony Fauci was decades ago.
Yeah. And so
So why wouldn't you believe him? He's the president of the United States. You're sort of conditioned to believe these people when they tell you that these lifelong bureaucrats are secret heroes, basically. I mean, you're sort of conditioned to go, oh yeah, they probably are. So when he tells you, hey, we really need to do this. When he convinces the president of the United States at the time, Donald Trump, this is what we need to do.
Well, and also the other thing is that for most people, like, you're in a job that you're qualified for, you're in a job that you do well, right? Because normally if you're in a job where you don't do well, like, that's not your job very long. And so, for normal people. And so, and so the thing is that, but also we've become so specialized as a society, right? Like, we've become so specialized, but not only have we become so specialized, is that, we did have this idea of sort of like trust the experts, right? Like, if somebody comes along and says, oh, like, well, actually things work like this, and that's their expertise, you would say, oh, like, okay, I kind of, I didn't realize that, or whatever, and so there was just this implicit kind of belief that everybody's doing their best, that everybody's relying on their expertise. But my frustration was really because, as an economist, what we think about is costs versus benefits.
Yeah.
And all they talked about were the costs, right? Like, so if we reopen the schools, like, what are the costs? And then but the thing is not even costs. It was like, what are the potential costs, right? But they never thought about, well, what are the benefits? Because actually the thing is like, this is an unpopular thing to say, but the optimal number of people who die from a pandemic is not 0. Like, it's not. Because to do that, the cost would be astronomical to human beings. The level of isolation you would have to create is so high. And so what that tells you is that tells you that there's this uncomfortable fact, which is that, like, there's an optimal number of deaths and it's a positive number. And so what we need to do is, like, we need to try to make sure that no more than that number die because we make stupid decisions. But we should, but at the same time, like, if we try to make decisions that push that number below that optimal amount, it's actually probably going to have some other cost on society that's going to outweigh the benefit of reducing those deaths. And that's not to minimize human life. It's not to minimize, like,
but that's why they did what they
things.
did. That's why the messaging was there can be, one is too many.
But see, that was the other thing, is that another important component of this, because I think you and I were on the exact same page with this. When it first happened, like, I was just kind of like, well, I mean, like, who knows? Like, sounds dangerous, right?
Yeah.
Okay. But we had the same moment, I think, where we realized this is a crock of shit, which is that the protests started going on.
Yes.
And when the protests started happening, at first they weren't saying anything about it. And what I noticed that they weren't saying anything about it, and I thought, well, they probably are afraid to say something because they don't want to, like, sound like they're minimizing what these people are protesting.
Of course.
Right? But then they didn't just not say anything. They came out and actually said, well, actually, it's good that they're out there protesting. And it was like, no. Right. You told me that I can't go to church. You told me that I can't go eat at a restaurant.
Kids can't go play basketball.
Yeah, that was the other thing. Well, and here's the other.
Can't go to the beach.
This is the other thing that I worry about because, getting back to your other point, is in my neighborhood, like, I would say probably, like, those first, like, 2, maybe 3 weeks, everybody did just kind of stay in their own house, not really go anywhere, like that kind of thing.
Yeah, same.
But I remember about 3 weeks in, the neighborhood parents started texting each other, and they were like, hey, does anybody care if our kids just go play with each other? Right? And so that was the thing and that's what really cracked me up, because that made what they were saying on television even more ridiculous.
Yeah.
Because there was not a single parent in my neighborhood that, well, at least that's not that texts, right? Like, as part of the group or whatever. There was not a single parent in the neighborhood that was like, no, my kids can't play or anything like that. Or even that just, like, didn't answer. Like, all the kids, they just started playing outside together.
And it was us all kind of admitting at that point that we don't really believe this.
Yeah. And the
right?
thing,
and so,
well, the thing is not only that, but you get feedback from that. Guess what? Your kids aren't getting sick. Like, guess what? Like, actually, like, things aren't that bad. But then you watch television and they're like, can't leave your house. Can't go to church. Can't go to a restaurant.
Yeah. Might have to do virtual school for another year.
Yeah. Like, all these things. And you're like, and that was the thing, is that human beings actually just start to make their own rules, like, because it's natural, right? Like, it's natural for us to just decide, I think it's okay. I'm going to use my own judgment on this, right? As a parent, I'm going to use my own judgment on this. And so people started doing that. And that's one of the things that cracked me up, because I remember, when Biden was elected and they were debating whether or not to send another round of checks to people. And I said at the time, I was like, this is a bad idea, because the reason you were sending people checks before is a lot of these people weren't working.
Right.
And so this was giving them a way to be able to continue to buy food and things, right? To survive.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But what I was looking at is that administration, their advisors, that political party, their heads were so buried in the sand, and they had made COVID such a important part of their campaign, of their party, of all of these things.
Yeah.
they had their heads buried in the sand. They were still talking like nobody was leaving their house. And I'm looking around going, everybody I know is back to normal. Every single person that I know is just living the same life they were living before. And they were acting like, oh, nobody's working, nobody's doing this, nobody's doing that. And like, we got to send out these checks and like, and that sort of thing. And it was like, no, like people have gone back to normal, but they were so wedded to this that like they couldn't see it. They couldn't see that people had resumed their lives. And the thing is that they inflicted incredible costs on society. And like, look at the test scores. You know who the test scores are? You know whose test scores are falling? Poor kids.
Yeah. Okay.
Poor kids.
That was my point on Carson.
Yeah.
Right? My point all along, I remember telling you this because you and I would talk on the phone. If 2 of my 3 kids are struggling with the access to things that they had, well, you don't have to be a genius to figure out that the kids who aren't as fortunate are going to really be struggling, probably exponentially more than my kids were struggling. And I was blown away that, well, yeah, but, it's what it is. I mean, and you would tell people Zoom classes don't work. And they would fight back on you. And you would tell people, if we do this for a long period of time, these kids aren't going to learn. And if they don't learn, there's going to be a learning gap. And if there's a learning gap, you're not going to be able to close the gap. And the kids who have no access to it, who it's not a learning gap, it's a learning, it's a complete learning canyon, they'll never catch up.
Well, I think the other thing too is,
and that's what's happened.
Well, I think the other thing too that people miss is that sometimes this doesn't show up in like students' performance, but it affects students in particular ways. So for example, since the pandemic, like as chair, I get a lot of students in my office.
Yeah.
Generally, they're there. If they're not my student, they're generally there to complain about something or to ask me a question about something that they don't understand or something like that. Like, not about like the actual like material, but about like the university, right? But the thing is like in meeting with these students, what I have seen is something that I've never seen before. And that is there is such an enormous gap from student to student in terms of what they believe is expected of them as a student. And that's not on that's not on them. These are like 18, 19-year-old kids. That's not on them. They have no idea. And that's the sad thing is that they were given extremely low expectations because people were phoning things in because Zoom classes suck and people were phoning things in. And those people now, they think that's how they think that's normal. And so like those
are pretty formative years.
And so
why would you not think that?
Yes. Normal? And so they think a lot of times that like what they're being asked of them is unfair or is too much. And these are the hardest conversations that I have to have with people because it's not their fault.
Yeah.
Like, but they're
paying the price for it.
Yes. But they're paying the price because they're going, oh, this is way too much work. Or I can't believe they asked me to do this. Or like, oh, I can't. And it's like, no, this is like what we've always done. But the other problem is like, here's the thing. If it was everybody, then some of that would just kind of go away over time. But it's not everybody.
Right.
Because there are kids who show up and they still recognize what the expectations are. And they know exactly what the expectations are and always have been. And then there are these other kids that show up and they have no idea what the expectations have always been. And it's not their fault. It's the fault of all of these people who lowered expectations, who phoned it in, who didn't give them the education that they deserved. And here's the other problem. Because they phoned it in and because they didn't give them the education that they deserved, they also tend to inflate those kids' grades. So it's not just that they see that they think there's lower expectations. They think it's easy to exceed the expectations.
Why would you not?
Yes. And it's not.
I mean, think about it. If you go through high school and you don't ever really study and you still make all A's.
Yeah, you're going to assume high school is easy for you.
Wouldn't you?
Yes. Yes. And that's the thing is that we have, I don't know what's going to happen because here's the other thing. I actually think that the people who come to me and talk to me about stuff where like they don't understand expectations, like I think those people are like I think in the long run they're going to be better off. Like the people that I feel bad for, right? Because the people who come to my office, we have to have a frank conversation about, no, this is kind of the expectation, and like I get
Yeah.
that, like that's, you know, I get that, you know, you might not like it or whatever, but that's, you know, that's kind of how we've always done things or whatever. And they but the thing is here's the thing, they understand. They understand, like after a conversation, like they don't come there to argue, right? They understand. But the thing is that what about the people who just kind of keep going and they go all the way through college with these believing that in these low expectations, and they graduate and they get a job? What happens at that first job?
Oh, it's bad.
It's not going to be good.
It's bad.
And and that's the thing, is that, you know,
it's so unfair.
Yes.
People talk about fairness. That's the
well, let's be honest here. Let's be honest. Okay. If we're going to be honest, there's also a correlation between like what the expectations were and what your family's income is, what your you know, what your school district, you know, spends on students, you know, all of these things, like, you know, how safe your school district is. All of those things are correlated with like maintaining the high expectations, right? And so the places that aren't maintaining the high expectations, these are going to tend to be in like poorer areas or underfunded schools, or you know, and those people are already at a disadvantage, and this is just exacerbating it.
Yeah, you're for lack of a better term, you're further stacking the deck.
And so, you know, when I was a kid, the Democratic Party we're the party of the working man. We're the party of poor people. They sure as hell aren't that anymore, because, like, you know, like the policies that they were leading were, you know, whether it was their allies in the teachers unions or whether that was like the party itself under the Biden administration, these were not made in the best interests of children. They were certainly not made in the best interest of poor children. They were certainly not, you know, made in the best interest of the working man, as they like to say, right? It is completely ridiculous. And I do, like, I hope that they start digging into this, because I want to know, I want to know where this funding was going. I want to know how it was affecting journalism. I want to know how it was affecting communication. I want to know, you know, how it was affecting guidance on policy. I want to know, like, how it was affecting censorship. I want to know all of those things. All of those things. We already know a lot about censorship, but we only know a lot about censorship because Elon Musk bought Twitter.
Yeah, well, like the Rogan interview with Zuckerberg. Did you listen to that?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. I mean, people say, well, Zuckerberg's self-serving. I'm like, yeah, he sure is. I mean, absolutely. Would he be saying all these things if Harris had won? No, of course not.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he saw that Harris wasn't going to win, and he got ahead of it because he's smart. But when you get past that, once you let yourself go, you bastard, like, you did a lot of that. And then you listen to him talk about the pressure that he had and who he had the pressure from. You go, whoa, that's pretty heavy. There was a lot going on. I mean, you took deep state. That's the deepest of deep states. I mean, that was the American government making the American people the enemy. I mean, I'm not going to dive into it. There was a stat I saw today. It was FBI related that was just flooring. I mean, it was, wow. If it's right, maybe it's wrong. I doubt it. It's probably not wrong. That's one thing that's happening now, is a lot of stuff that's coming out now is like factual because they had the data for the first time. And it's incredible what we were going through. And I'm not saying Trump's the great savior, but I will say Trump coming in and going, no, we're gonna basically pour disinfectant on all of this is good. No matter what you think of Trump, what you think of his policies, if you think whatever you think of his rhetoric about Gaza and, hey, we're gonna go turn Gaza into another Las Vegas or whatever he said. I mean, some of that stuff I think is for dramatic effect. I think it's what do the kids call it, trolling? I think there's a lot of trolling going on, and you can argue that the president of the United States should not be trolling. I'm kind of with you, frankly, but I think that's kind of what that is. But there is, and he said this on the campaign trail, and I'm gonna give him credit. He said there was going to be a return to common sense, and we are slowly seeing, not slowly, pretty fast, 3 weeks, seeing a lot of common sense getting injected into things.
Well, we also have to pay attention to the strategy, because the thing that we have to realize is, like, right now we look at all these things that they're doing and all of these sources of funding that they're discovering and all of that kind of stuff. And as they do that, they're moving extremely quickly through all of this stuff. It's like drinking from a fire hose. It's every day. There's just like, it's not every day. It's like every hour. There's just like you hear something and you're like, wow. And then like 6 minutes later, you're like, oh, wow. Like, and then pretty much an hour later, you're like, oh man, I forgot about the other 5 things that I was thinking about this morning, because there's so much stuff. But here's why that's actually important, because not all of this stuff is going to work out.
Yeah.
Like some of this stuff, like, because here's what's coming. What's coming is there's a bunch of Democrat lawyers who are going to start suing, and they're going to start suing to argue that some of these executive orders like violate the Constitution or exceed the powers of the presidency,
the funding pauses, right, and things. Yeah.
And all these kinds of things. But here's the deal. The faster that you do this, like, I'm not sure this would actually work in any other circumstance. Like, I'm really not. Like, when I said, like, why didn't any other Republican do this? I mean, I think I just discovered the answer to my question. I don't know how you would actually do this without a president like Donald Trump and without somebody leading the charge like Elon Musk. Because the thing is like, they're moving so quickly, but they're making public every single thing that they're doing. And not only that, they're highlighting the most outrageous stuff that they find. And the reason that that's important is that can actually push congressional action, right? So, for example, if people get sufficiently outraged, it doesn't matter who sues and says that this executive order is an overreach. Congress can pass a law saying, yep, like, we're actually revoking this funding, or we're shutting down this agency, or whatever the case may be. And then there's no question anymore about constitutionality. And I think that by doing this so quickly, by putting all of this outrageous stuff out there, you're building popular support for what you're doing. And without that popular support, you would probably die in the courtroom. Like, you would get so inundated with all of these court cases. And the problem is if you can generate the public on your side, you don't necessarily have to rely on the outcome from the courts. You can rely on Congress actually stepping up and do something, because we know that the only thing that Congress ever really does is stuff that's really, really popular. And so if you can create enough outrage, you can potentially galvanize Congress to come along and go, you know what? Yeah, we're just going to actually, there's some question about whether or not you can get rid of that funding. Well, here's the deal. We're going to revoke the funding, right? We're going to pass a law that says, like, we're not allocating that funding going forward. And so the thing is that I think in a lot of ways you had to have somebody who saw the mess from the inside, who was willing to spend the political capital to actually go after all of this stuff. But then, like, Elon is actually kind of like an important component of this, because if you were just doing this with like some random bureaucrat in DC, how good are they going to be at publicizing it? Like, Elon's on Twitter constantly just like, look at what we found. Look at what we found. Here's another thing. Look at how ridiculous this is, right? And I think that it's the combination of all of these different factors that are kind of working together to, like, turn public opinion towards, nope, this is actually what we want. This is what we elected this person to go do.
Got a Super Bowl pick?
I hope that I never turn the television on.
If you do, one thing you won't see this year is from The Athletic reporting this. Super Bowl in New Orleans will mark the first time since February of 2021 that end racism is not included as a message in the back of the end zone, according to NFL sources.
Does that mean racism is over? Or
I guess we've ended it. What a victory. The game will be played between two teams comprised of biologically assigned males at birth. What's so funny? Yeah, Trump signed an executive order today. This has created outrage. Designed to prevent people who were biologically assigned male at birth from participating in women's or girls' sporting events. This is the one that's wild to me. Honestly, Like of all the things that people fight about, like I understand the people that have outrage about certain different things. That's fine. You know, we have disagreements about you, you if you're against preventing men from playing in women's sports, I just I can't even have a conversation with you. I don't understand how that should be pretty one of those deals where like when you poll 100 people, it's like 100 to nothing. I mean, everybody's like, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I went to 2 soccer games last night, back to back. Went and cheered for the Oxford girls. They beat Germantown in the first round. Congratulations to the Chargers. They play Clinton on Friday night. Hopefully they can pull that off against the Arrows. Be tough task. Clinton's very good. Regardless, I watched that game. Good game. Very entertaining. A lot of fun. Girls played really, really hard. And then 30 minutes later, the boys played against Starkville. Let's not talk about the outcome. I don't want to talk about it anymore. Totally different game. Totally different game. It's not the same game. Now, it's the same game, same rules, played completely differently. I didn't say one was better than the other. They were both entertaining. But one is different than the other. And you would not have wanted your daughter, no matter how skilled. I'll give you an example. Madison Strum scored 3 goals for Oxford. Our parents are wonderful people. Madison's a very good player. She's a striker, forward, very good player. Very smart, really understands the game. Always kind of puts herself in position where she kind of sees things ahead of time. Very, very good player. I've enjoyed watching her play over the years. She's our boy's age. Her father, her mother would not want her on the field with the boys. She'd be a real good chance she'd get hurt. Why? Because she's different. This is not controversial.
No, look, here's how you could settle the question. Why do we have separate sports for girls? Like Ole Miss has a men's basketball team, they have a women's basketball team. Why don't they just have a basketball team? If everybody's the same,
save some money.
If everybody's the same,
I'm just saying.
If everybody's the same, why don't they just play on the same team?
You get halfway to your $20 million. I'm just saying. It's a thought. I'm kidding. No, you don't. Well, there's a reason you don't do it.
Yeah, it's completely obvious. Like I mean,
there's a reason you have a men's tennis team and a women's tennis team. It doesn't mean that men's tennis is better than women's tennis or vice versa. It just means that anyone who looks at it rationally goes, well, if you put the men against the men are going to win 99.9 something percent of the time at that level. Yeah, if they put you and me out there on the tennis court with 2 of the Ole Miss women's tennis team players, they're going to kick our ass. I mean, we're not skilled. But if I take the number 1 and 2 men's tennis players at Ole Miss, and I put them up against the number 1 and 2 women's tennis players at Ole Miss, and you say bet, I'm like, hey, all my money's on those guys. They're gonna win unless they don't try. I mean, so I don't. This is dumb. This is when I think this is the common sense thing. But this is the kind of thing that people say to me, hey, you don't need to be saying these things. And I say, why?
No, but that's the thing is like, I think that I don't know if we talked about this publicly, but I mean, we've talked about it privately. It's like, it's kind of costly for me to be vocal about political issues. I don't exactly have the sort of political beliefs that endear you to fellow academics, right?
Yeah.
Okay. But the reason that
I firmly believe it hurts my career. Just to be.
Oh, look, I got this the other day. I did this long like thread on Twitter about, like why the Trump administration was using tariffs. And I was getting people in my profession like either publicly saying it or like, privately like messaging me, basically like accusing me of like not understanding what was going on or being a bad economist or making excuses for the Trump administration or what, these kinds of things. And it's like, no. Like, actually, like, if you read that, like, there's not a single political statement in it. And actually, if you compare like my thread to what all these other people were writing, mine actually involves way more economic analysis than theirs.
Yeah.
And their position on this is actually predictable based on what I know about them and their personality. Whereas my position on this isn't necessarily predictable based on what people know about my politics and my personality. But the thing is that people have to, I view it as like, I started doing this because there were things that needed to be said that nobody would say. And you know, there are things that still need to be said that nobody will say. And this is one of those things. Like, this is not hard. We already have separate men's and women's sports. So clearly we recognize that there is some level of difference between men and women.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, they'd play together already. And the idea that because you were born a man and then you want to be a woman, that you should then be allowed to play women's sports, like, that just denies fundamental biological reality.
So,
and that's not controversial to say.
No.
It's not. This is. It's not unscientific to say.
No.
What's unscientific is to write a headline like ESPN wrote that said, you know, persons assigned male at birth can now know
people who are biologically assigned male at birth.
Right. Like, what is, like, that's utter nonsense.
So
that's straight
males,
out of
boys.
That's straight out of like 1984. This is this. It is not unreasonable to say that biological males should not be playing women's sports. That's not. That's not a controversial statement.
No.
We don't let. We don't. Just because it doesn't. Like, you cannot. There are fundamental aspects. I don't care what hormones you get on. I don't care what, like, other things that you can do to your body to change it. Like, there are inherent differences that are not going to go away just from doing those medical treatments.
Of course.
They're just not going to go away.
Of course.
And anybody out there, I mean, the thing that drives me crazy is that it gets back to your point from earlier about Levitt, is that, you know, you have these women who are like, we need to empower women. And then when a woman comes along that disagrees with them, they're like, oh, well, she only has that job because she's beautiful. Okay, first of all, like, if your objective is to empower women, what do you care if she's beautiful or not?
Who cares, right?
Like,
right.
You should be celebrating her. In fact, what did these very same people say when people would criticize Biden's press secretary? People would say, oh, she got the job because she's African American, or she got the job because she's a lesbian, or she got the job because of whatever, right? People would make that argument.
Yeah.
And then their response every time would be, but she's qualified. That's what they would always say.
Yeah.
And they would say, so she might have gotten chosen for those reasons, but she's good at the job. You'll notice they don't do that with the people that they disagree with. So when Levitt has the job, they don't say she got the job because she's beautiful, but she's really good at the job.
Yeah, and again, we're wrapping up. To finalize on that point, if Caroline Levitt, let's say they're right, for the sake of the argument, Donald Trump and his people hired Caroline Levitt to be their spokesperson because she's beautiful. That's it. They said, hey, here's what we're going to do. We're going to conduct a search, and we're going to find a really attractive female, and we're going to put her as the press secretary. Okay, cool. She would have gotten exposed.
Very quickly.
Like, quick. I mean, within a minute.
It's not an easy job.
It's an incredibly difficult job that requires a tremendous... I mean, there are people who are very, very bright who have stumbled in that job. So she would have gotten exposed. And so the moment that she showed that, no, she has the mental acumen, for lack of a better word, to handle this, and not only to handle it, but to handle it with a ferocity, really. You very quickly get past the, oh yeah, she happens to be attractive. And so once that happens, instead of her being celebrated, instead of people saying, oh, wasn't this great? You know what? I was wrong. I was wrong. I did the sexist thing, and I just kind of accused them of, hey, they hired this young 27-year-old hottie. I was wrong. She's sharp. Wow. Look at her. No, they don't do that. I always have this argument with people about like sideline reporters all the time. They're like, oh, the only reason those people got those jobs is because they're good looking. And I'll say honestly, okay, yeah, that helped. No doubt. You know, Taylor McGregor's been on the show. Cubs dugout reporter, ESPN sideline reporter. Is Taylor McGregor attractive? Yeah, of course. Is that the reason she kept the job? No. Because she'd get exposed if she were a complete idiot.
Well, it's what's seen and what's not seen, right? So the thing is you can look at every sideline reporter and you can say, all the sideline reporters are attractive. Therefore, attractiveness is a qualification you must have. But what you don't see is you don't see all of the attractive people
who didn't get the job,
don't have that job
who
because they're terrible at it.
Who can't get the job.
Correct.
Like when I've had young female aspiring journalists reach out about, hey, maybe doing some things or whatever. And I'm like, what do you want to do? And they're like, I want to be Erin Andrews. Okay. I'm like, I want you to understand something. Because I've met Erin Andrews and I know people who know her well. I mean, you need to understand this is a really bright, informed person. This is a person who knows more sports than you can ever imagine knowing, who can be proficient in a conversation with professional front office people. And if you think that all of those front office people are only talking to Erin Andrews because she's good looking, you're stupid. At that point, you're painting with the broadest of broad brushes. No, she's made it to that point because she's worked really hard. She's made it to that point. Did it help for her initially, probably, to be attractive? Of course. Of course.
I don't notice a lot of ugly people on TV either.
Right. I mean, it's part of the deal. It's,
Well, but this gets to a broader point. The broader point is beauty is actually something to be celebrated.
Sure.
Now, I get like in a human being that like there's multiple aspects of beauty, right? Okay. And I get that a lot of like we're two bald guys, okay? Like so like this is not like we're like, we're not up here defending like you don't get to choose.
You're not about to tell me that I'm not.
You don't get to choose.
I'm not good looking, are you?
You don't get to choose. Like neither one of us got to choose whether we have hair. No one gets to choose whether they're good looking, right? No one gets to choose this. Nobody gets to choose whether they're good looking. Nobody gets to choose whether they're going to have hair or be bald. Like nobody gets to choose that. But that doesn't mean it's not something that to admire and celebrate. We should admire beauty everywhere, in people, in places, in buildings. Like we should want a beautiful society. That's actually what we should want. And that doesn't mean that like if you're not the most beautiful person in the room that we should treat you poorly. But it also means that if you are the most beautiful person in the room, we shouldn't treat you poorly because you're beautiful. We should celebrate beauty in everything, in people, in our surroundings, in everything that we do. We should celebrate it.
All I heard was bald, and you act like bald.
Hey, bald is beautiful. Look, I think I look better with no hair than I did with hair. That could be cope, okay? but that is that is a belief that I have. And
I remember that story in Cosmopolitan about all young girls grow up fantasizing about a bald guy. And I just believed it.
Yep.
I can't ever find the story, but I'm sure I read it somewhere.
Well, I mean it's
bound to have been.
It's had to be true.
Yeah, I mean, so, of course. I mean, I'm saving up for the big trip to Istanbul to get the Turkish transplant. I don't even do it now. 20 years ago, might have done it. Josh, as always, thank you for the time. Thanks to everybody in the stream. Appreciate people bearing with us with the technical issues earlier. So that does it for this edition of the Josh Hendrickson Show. I'm Neal McCready. Josh Hendrickson will be back in a couple of weeks. God only knows where we'll talk about at that point. Till then, take care.